There's a bit of a tension here between I'll make my tool really easy for you to use. In essence, what I mean is you get to see less and less of what I'm doing.
On one hand, yeah, they're giving it away because they want to hook you into the ecosystem. But on the other hand, you could say, well, they're giving it away, and actually you can build useful and interesting things with it.
Used to build a behavioral profile of that particular student that may or may not be correct. We have gathered a meeting of the minds to have a discussion about commercialization of AI in the educational space and in edtech. And we started with the keyword, the infiltration of commercialization. So we will unpack that a little bit in our conversation. But I thought maybe we could start with everybody introducing themselves. And Al, maybe you want to go first?
Happy to, Clara. Hi, folks. I'm Al Kingsley. I introduce myself fairly consistently as a man of two hats. I probably should change that to a few more by now. But 30 years in the educational technology space, plus on one side, and the last 20 plus years in various roles in academies, multi-academy trusts, Department for Education, supporting schools in different ways. And when I'm not looking and observing and learning, I tend to get encouraged to write books around those different topics.
Brilliant. Matthew?
Yeah, I hate following Al for introductions. I'm just a head teacher, small school, Lake District, Northern England, which is like a separate country to London, if I'm brutally honest, in every way, shape or form. And for that, I am grateful sometimes as well. But it is nice to visit.
A blooming amazing primary school in the Lake District.
Winging it for 15 years.
Yeah, so I'm Darren. I've been winging it for 27. Former head teacher, former schools group manager. Now I work along with Clara in AI, focusing on governance and leadership and tools, training, support, anything AI related. And I also, like Matt, live up in the north of England, where it's the only place to be.
Unless you're in Spain.
Yeah, okay. Apart from Spain, obviously, yeah.
I was just enjoying the warm weather today. But so I'm Clara, and as Darren mentioned, we work together on AI governance. I'm a computer scientist and also an AI ethicist, but I'm also a former teacher and have worked many years in education and worked with edtech companies, and both in public education and international global education as well. I'm passionate about AI governance, so if you meet me, I will be talking about regulation, which nobody else wants to talk about, and policies, and I'm quick to call out bad tech, but hope I balance it occasionally with also sending my compliments when we do see good tech. So that's my little spiel. So, Al, I thought maybe we could start with talking a little bit about commercialization in education and what that is and what that looks like from the school side, from schools and colleges.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and we should really have a stopwatch going here because we could all go off down different journeys. I think there's a number of strands here. So the first thing is we all accept within our education systems we have technology that we use for purpose, and as we perhaps evolve, like every other sector, there is a pressure for some to introduce not the technology that we need, but the technology that people would like us to use. And I think there's a clear distinction. I think within that, we also tend to generalize on a term around the world of edtech, educational technology, which in my head is something that is a tool that's purposely made for education, with education, in other words, pedagogically aligned, versus tools that we have to use in education because we've got no choice, that get lumped in the edtech role. So I think right now, when we have this challenging conversation, let's use a really simple example. I guess we see in North America, you can have a choice of being a Microsoft or a Google house with your AI tools, and they'll spend many millions helping train you and provide your professional development. Is that goodwill and gesture, or is that an intent to ensure that those school districts become embedded using a certain flavour of technology that ensures they continue to use those other tools? And then we might trip on from that in our conversations, Clara, areas that I know many of you have passion around, which is, and if we're using those tools, what happens to our data and why are they doing it? And is it for the lifetime of a child, or is it to capture that child into their adulthood and yada, yada, yada? So I think what we look at first of all is, as an education system, are we identifying a need and going out and selecting relevant tools that can genuinely mitigate a problem? Or are we finding a stronger push to adopt tools where we didn't necessarily have a need, but we feel obliged to because they're the talk of the town? There's my starter for 10 for us to unpick. So given we're all going to bear a little bit of a pass the baton around here, let me pass it straight back to you, Clara, and say, tell me what you think.
Yeah, I am reminded of when we met at the That's EdTech conference in January, and I believe Darren and I calculated something like 172 new EdTech startups that were all saying we have AI in our systems. People were handing out flyers saying try AI for £10, and we reflected a little bit on that also when we met. This sort of boom, this explosion of new technology, and I think as you point out, what is a real challenge for schools is to find their way through the sort of quagmire of what is the technology we really need that can help optimize our administrative tasks, like school management systems or enterprise packages like Microsoft Office or Google Worksheet, in order for people to work more effectively. And then the EdTech that is supposed to be designed for pedagogical purposes. And what we see with a lot of the EdTech that are springing up is that the typical commercial models that have worked well in other places, often EdTech, are simply commercial models that have sort of been fine-tuned or has the right look for what would fit into the education, but are not initially designed with children in mind and not from the ground up designed with pedagogy in mind. So we are seeing a lot of EdTech that are really complex that are being offered up to schools. And Matthew, that leads me to a question I have for you. Because the commercialized model, the entry into schools is often to give teachers free access to individual accounts so they can test it out. And so what happens is that teachers ad hoc are trying different models, and then if they like them and if they find that they can scale them to their department, that then becomes the entry point for that technology to be subscribed for the whole school. Are you seeing an increased pressure and more advertising and marketing around individual teachers trying out these free new models, and do you see that as a benefit to your organization, or?
We don't really see that, if I'm honest. So we are seeing emails that are very different approaches for marketing, in that it's emails that start with, after our phone call last week, when you start to question whether you've actually had that phone call and you haven't. But I think what you've just described there, in terms of a teacher possibly getting an invitation at a school and then trying something and then trying to get it out throughout the school, reflects one of the big issues in education in England, which is the most fractured, divided sector possible. So when we talk about EdTech, I think I'm not quite sure there's a big enough acknowledgement of the huge numbers of schools that are blissfully aware of most of this EdTech, at which point they then become susceptible to the ones with the biggest marketing budgets, as opposed to the best products. So when we talk about the commercialisation, I always try and split it into, actually, businesses are there to make money, but there's good products and bad products. But going back to your question, no, not really. But I don't think we're a typical school, that we have our small core number of things that we've had for a few years, and we tend to stick with them. It's very rare we move things, although a friend of ours, and I'm sure you all know Caroline Key, has just created a oh, she's just doing a PhD, isn't she? And she's done it on digital readiness, and it's, having read a summary of it, not all 170,000 words of the PhD. The concept of edtech that actually isn't obsolete after 3 to 4 years has really sort of jumped out at me, that most software you need to renew or refresh or change it every 3 or 4 years as well. And I just keep going back to this fractured situation in education, and the government released, I think it was about a year ago, about £4 million in AI funding for schools and training and things. And you just think, well, you've got, I don't know what large percentage of schools that haven't got an infrastructure and haven't had CPD and don't know what they're doing, not in a nasty way, just, haven't had that initial support and CPD. So the concept of this cold calling emails running edtech adoption in this country is quite a worry, I think.
Matt, I might just come back to and then signpost Darren in on this, because there's a few strands there. I have is it the fortune or the curse of seeing it from both sides? So within my multi-academy trust and our schools, we see that influx of marketing, often pushing tools based on what I would say sometimes is quite dubious evidence. And then on the other side, I also see, and I shared at the beginning, I have a hat with an EdTech role. I chair the British Education Suppliers Association's EdTech group. So there are some pillars and standards there. But at the same time, I think those folks who have long history involved in proper pedagogically aligned EdTech also worry when they see technology that is promising to be the panacea to everything that really doesn't back it up. And that's a challenge. Now, Darren, I know, has done lots of research and looked at lots of things from an AI perspective, but I think one of the questions that we need to kind of unpick from here, and I'm conscious our audience virtually with today may have more of an Australian flavour, but when we need to find that balance, because often it's about how do we have the frameworks in our schools to effectively choose the right tools. That lifespan thing is really important. I'd love to find a slot further on in our conversation to talk about sticky software, because that's a real vendor strategy and one that I've done quite a bit of work around. But I think it comes to, maybe we come full circle to, we know companies are out to sell. We know many companies are out for a short win rather than a long-term relationship. How do we empower educators to be sufficiently informed to challenge and make the right choices? Darren, help me out.
Yeah, so, just back to your first point, basically, are you a Microsoft school or a Google school? I think it's fairly... I don't think it takes a genius to work out that it is purely commercial. They have no actual interest in the end user or their long-term benefit or otherwise. They want to lock you into an ecosystem. We've seen the same thing with Apple with iPads, back in the early 2010s. So I led one of the first schools, it was the first state sixth form in the UK to go iPad 1-to-1, and I became an Apple professional developer. So I worked with Apple, inside Apple, for actually many years. And it's fairly safe to say that, they want you in their ecosystem. They want you using their products, and so they want these kids to be using the products from an early age as possible. The biggest challenge that we have right now, and I think Al, you also articulated this at the start, as did Clara, is that basically we have products which is fundamentally ill-suited to pedagogy. They're very good for organizing. They're very good for organization. They're very good for getting things in the right place, getting your files in the right place and sharing stuff, etc., etc. When it comes to actually being in the classroom and actually genuinely moving teaching and learning on and being a genuine support to teaching and learning, there are very few tools that I think do support it. I think that the ones that we're starting to see maybe have a little bit more impact around things like the Google tools like Notebook LM and Google Gems, that, we might start to see a little bit more them to be a little bit more useful for students to use. But most of the EdTech that we've had to date, particularly with AI, if I look at the AI in the last 2 to 3 years, tends to sit sort of outside the classroom, so with planning and resourcing and assessment. But as yet, we've not seen many tools that if we were to give them to pupils, they would genuinely support their learning and genuinely move them on. The only other thing just to add at the end, Clara, you mentioned 170. Actually, there were over 700 stands at BET, and about 500 of them had some sort of AI inside. So You know, you
Can I just challenge you, Darren?
Yes.
I think this conversation, because I mean, you and I, we were all quite aligned on this one, I suppose. I do think at times it's important to recognise the distinction between the AI that's been slotted in as a value add, the marketing catch from BET, and the fact that actually within education we have had some non-generative AI platforms being used by learners and learning pathways for quite a few more years, and some with some level of pedagogical evidence and impact in terms of learning pathways. Some, we might argue, perhaps we can fill in the gaps, will be down to the fact that actually we're at a pathway where at the moment some of these tools, they may not be pedagogically aligned, but it may also be that teachers aren't really clear on how to adapt the process to use them more effectively. That's a bit of a challenge because of yin and the yang. I'm more aligned with there's more benefit outside than inside the classroom with AI, but I've seen some great tools, scanning text and feedback and so on, that move in the right direction. My last one I'm going to sprinkle in for our conversation down the line is when we're talking about commercialisation in education and we get a little bit nervous for all the right reasons. We wouldn't have had any CPD at BET or EduTech Australia or anywhere else if the commercialisation of education didn't exist and they didn't bring us all together into a really big room to share best practice. And that's the challenge, which is almost like you have to accept a little bit of the pill in order to get access to all the other things that you want, that funding piece. That's me being intentionally confrontational to say how many events in CPD would happen if there wasn't somebody footing the bill.
Yeah, it's a good point. Also, I think if we look at generative AI that we have now, there is a lot that's given away that enables, you could say on the one hand, yeah, they're giving it away because they want to hook you into the ecosystem. But on the other hand, you could say, well, they're giving it away and actually you can build useful and interesting things with it. And it has potential to really genuinely support learning. But I think you're right. I think it's about it's combining the tools with the training. And it's that understanding at every level as to how to use them. Because if you don't use them, if you don't work out how to use them intentionally, what tends to happen is that they're used, poorly as a shortcut. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that raises the question about like how do we empower educators and also the decision makers. Often it comes in a little bit ad hoc, or it's left to the IT department to kind of thumbs up, thumbs down on the technology, or school leaders who have many other things to attend to and don't necessarily have the technical understanding to vet what kind of technology that is coming in. And then I think we also see in that process that because schools rarely understand what they're really buying, it's difficult for procurement teams to kind of understand whether they're being lured in by the sort of the AI-powered catch-all that we have now, and whether they end up having their teachers and their students kind of become beta testers for this technology, and whether they're developing this commercial dependence, and whether that outweighs the benefit of having the technology at all. And I think that is problematic because especially when some of these professional development events are sponsored by tech companies or facilitated by tech companies, that conversation about empowerment and building educator agency around when to push back and recognizing when is this a commercial overpromise or when is it a tech that essentially misrepresents what happens in real time. I think that we're missing that building of autonomy around decision making for our individual educators, and I think that's one of the risks when we don't have a non-tech funding option for schools to do this process in a different way. And I think that's one of the areas where we really need national governments to step in. I think what comes to mind is also, as Al says, there are different forms of AI. Google entered the classroom, I think we're up to 23 years now, 22 and a half years ago. And that has had a real impact on how students are learning, on how teachers teach. Google is not a neutral search engine. It directs what responses you get based on different parameters in the algorithm and the training. And we haven't really even understood the impact of digitalization and early AI, and now we have this new wave coming in of tech, but we really haven't solved some of those problems of old. So that lingers into us still doing business as usual, when in fact I believe we're in an environment where we really have to step back and develop a whole new methodology for procurement, for deciding what AI should be coming into the classroom, and what type of AI should be staying out.
I'm quite keen. I invited Matt to come and speak at an event at Visa for me around that dynamic of building relationships with vendors, because at some point I'd like to share kind of a bit of a rubric that I often share to schools about how to make the right stepping stones as part of their digital strategy when it comes to assessment. But of course, when it comes to AI, the landscape's changing, because we've got legal frameworks and other considerations to drop into that as well with folks like your good selves. But Matt, I just thinking from your perspective, you shared much more about it was the technology was but one part. It was about relationship and how those bits come together as part of that assessment.
In part, yeah. I've just written a few things down, like going back to the Google, Microsoft. What would you call it? Promotion, marketing, and schools having to choose one or the other, or Apple if we bring it into three. We're a Google reference school, and every year I get contacted by Google to say you've not uploaded which schools you've supported to the whatever portal it is, and every year I say no, I'm not going to, and take it away from me if you want to, because we use Google, but I don't see us as a Google school, so that's a conscious decision on our part. When I hear things like procurement team and tech team, I do laugh, because of 3,500 schools in England that are small schools. We don't really have procurement teams or tech teams, and small schools consistently get left out of every conversation. And I would quite happily argue that small schools are the best schools in the country. Every school has strengths and weaknesses, but small schools are definitely the best. So I think that's worth mentioning. And the BET show has come up several times now. The BET show is an international technology market in my book, and we take our kids to it. So I think in the context of all these conversations we're having about all the companies that were there last year, the kids laughed about the AI-driven companies, because every company had an AI-driven banner that's appeared. But I would say 99% of schools in the UK never go to the BET show. I would say 95% are blissfully unaware of it. And I think that's quite representative of the issues we've got in terms of actually making schools and teachers aware of what's out there, and that there's that disconnect and that fractured system, like I say. But in terms of what you just referenced there, Al, we use very few things, and we use Google Workspace free version, because you don't need the paid version in a school, which Google won't tell you so much, as the basis for everything. And we have very few things that we use, but yeah, a lot of them we've had for long term, and it's relationships, and we've got to know the people running them. ThingLink and Louise Jones would be one good example. And that's, the kids have used generative AI for a long time before most of the schools have become aware of it, I would say, because it was Skybox Blockade Labs, I think, joined with ThingLink, and it was the school that tweeted them and got the partnership going. We've got a relationship with a school, with a business in Croatia called STEMI, which is now no longer displaying at BET, but it's doing very well in other countries because it's an easy market to access. But one of the things we did with STEMI 5-6 years ago, and like I said, we've got this good relationship that you referenced with other people. We've got that with STEMI, and one of the units to do was ethics. And it was the ethics of using technology, and actually we've kept that going ourselves. So kids in this school we've got a really, really sensible, mature understanding, better than most adults, I would say, that actually sometimes you don't need to use technology, and actually AI, you don't need to use AI. We don't want to use it, want it to be our writing. And I think I'm quite fortunate in that I've come across various people, and I follow various people. I've got networks, and actually that relationship and that awareness of what you should and shouldn't be doing, and who you can actually go to for advice and support, is as important as anything. And I've certainly said several times in the past, the EdTech clique, group, whatever you want to call them, are lovely, lovely people, brilliantly helpful. I just feel that most of the education system isn't connected to them, which I feel is a bit of a shame sometimes, because that relationship could do so much positive stuff for so many schools. And that's not their fault or anybody else's fault. You know, the pressures in school at the moment in terms of accountability, finances, the concept of a school going to bet, you know, it would cost us $3,000 on the train. It's insane.
Matt, if we take that and scale it globally, because I think around the world there'll be people listening, depending on where they are, who will say, depending on your networks, your geographical position in a different country, and I'm thinking in the case of Australia, there's quite a lot of geography there where you're not going to be close to an event or anything else. There's going to be a mix between those that feel they're really well informed about EdTech and those that feel they're on the outside. So the important bit you shared was sometimes less is more, do a few good things well. When I talk to schools about their digital strategy and selecting products, I'm always really mindful to say, split the evaluation between the pedagogy and the digital. You can't expect the person who's going to be able to make the right decisions about the technology from a classroom perspective to also be the expert on your network infrastructure and your storage and your other data protection considerations.
Can I just jump in one thing?
Yeah.
I was just interested in speaking to people in Australia.
Yeah.
Nick Jackson, who was on, and it's
Yeah.
the whole concept of online education and digital education and things. Obviously, Australia, the geography itself means that for decades they have actually been doing it by radio and things like that. So their adoption and their understanding of the pedagogy behind it in some states is much better
there's
developed
lots
than
of
ours.
positives coming out of a certain regions who are used to it. But I guess the area I was feeding into really to spark Clara and Darren a kind of a conversation point is there's lots of considerations about think about the infrastructure and have we got the right connectivity and space and storage to use this tool, and we've got a conversation around what is it and does it have curriculum value, is it pedagogically aligned and so on. But suddenly when we add the word AI, we add an extra step and layer of considerations that many feel not very well informed about, and that's where we fall into the space of you either wing it or you know who to go ask. And so I think that's kind of my cue, Clara and Darren. How is AI changing that challenge of accessibility safely to the right EdTech tools?
I think a lot of that does come down to the fact that AI is a black box. So we don't really know, and no one really knows exactly what happens behind the curtain. And that, you know, when we're talking about sensitive data, PII, that then becomes quite a concern. So, you know, one of the big challenges that schools will have is where is my data going? Where is it being stored? How is it being processed? Where is it being processed? What is the retention policy on the data? Because there are lots of different steps. It's not just like, I don't know, using an MIS where it's in a database and you have some process which pulls that information through to a front end and you work with it in your dashboard, for example. Now we're sending data and it's going and it's being processed and it's being, you know, having AI look at it and do whatever it needs to do with it, and then it's being pushed back to us. So I think certainly the primary concern that schools have, and I mean, we work with a lot of schools across the world, is, you know, I'm nervous about using it because I don't know what's happening to my data. And so I think that's that added layer of complexity. So again, this is one of the reasons why schools will more likely use Copilot or Google Workspace over any other tool, because, you know, Microsoft will say, well, actually, you know, if you use Copilot inside of your A1 or A3 or A5, whatever license, then your data's safe. You know, and Google will say the same thing. So I think one of the challenges that third parties have, so in other words, not Google and not Microsoft, one of the challenges is being able to convince or persuade, I'm not sure what the right term is, being able to kind of, you know, demonstrate that the data is safe. So that, I think that's one of the main considerations for most schools when it comes to generative AI.
Clara, can I just ask you, adding on that bit, there's a bit of a tension here between I'll make my tool really easy for you to use and a commercialization model. If I make it really, really easy, in essence, what I mean is you get to see less and less of what I'm doing. How does that kind of play out in an AI conversation?
So my entry point is always AI governance, of course. And we know with this type of technology, the easier it is to use, the easier it is for them to commercialize. But it also means that it maintains its position as an extraction tool. So when you're building the algorithm to personalize, for example, we hear a lot about personalization and individualization. What they're essentially doing is they're reshaping pedagogy down to a format that can be measured and monetized. So that could be something like test scores or engagement metrics or predictive analysis of that particular student. And I think there is the rub for me, and I think it digs in a little bit to what Darren mentioned around the data, because the data has commercial predictive value. It helps the tool get better, and it helps identify how well the student can meet the targets that can be measured and monetized. So indicators, not necessarily human growth. And when we do that, when we're using that kind of technology, we see that this data can be used for benefits in a different way with generative AI. So before, it might be used to optimize that particular piece of technology, but now the data itself can be used to train generative AI and also can be used as a predictive indicator of that particular student's behavior. So, for example, there is an edtech company out of the UK, and one of the things that they do is they track the mouse clicks or the mouse pad clicks of the students when they are using the technology. It allows them to see through behavioral profiling how they are engaging in the content that they're supposed to go through. It seems like a great idea. But with generative AI, this data can now be used to train generative AI, and it can also be used to build a behavioral profile of that particular student that may or may not be correct. We don't know because it's very opaque, as Darren says, it's very sort of black box. So it becomes incredibly hard for us as adults to identify whether the student is actually getting the optimal benefits of the educational technology. And I think that's where we run into trouble. I have talked to edtech companies that are really working now on figuring out how to partner with schools, individual small schools or large trusts or school groups, but to really try to figure out, like, how do we sift through this maze together? But the vast majority of edtech companies are still offering up technology, often for free, maybe to see the market, but definitely in order for them to collect this very valuable child data, where we can essentially get information about future purchasing habits or other things that can be sold to other vendors, allowing for more revenue streams. So I think there we really need to see more of these opt-in functions in our generative AI models before we launch them in the classroom. And we are not really having many of these conversations yet, unfortunately.
So I don't think anyone listening today is going to disagree with us that says an educational platform should not take and share data for any additional purpose. That idea of ring fencing, and we've seen certain challenges in the courts already over the years with you know, and I'm always really mindful to say, with a very small percentage, the majority who are heavily invested don't, but there's more scope when it comes to AI, because often people are using tools that they don't control themselves. So there's obviously a bit of a yin and a yang there. But if we're listening as folks and saying, well, let's take it as a given that any educational tool shouldn't take the data and share it anywhere else, is that enough? Or is the fact that we can't see the decision making it takes, the bias it might apply, those other factors, things that when we're talking about education versus healthcare, defense, or any other sector, mean there needs to be a little bit more transparency, a bit more light inside the window on that black box that Darren did? I think, Matt, you wanted to come in on that last point as well.
No, I was just listening to Clara and the whole mouse tracking. information, data collection is the algorithms that are being used out there just terrify me, to be honest. And I just don't know if you remember, I posted a while back, our children are going anonymous online. So a big part of what we're teaching them is that actually their email accounts will not be names. We're trying to give them digits, and we're trying to teach them not to enter any personal data when they're using anything. Data will still be collected, but from their perspective of anonymity, that's, I think, the best we can do. And I just remember speaking to you, I think, and the last advice I could find about school emails was Vector in 2002. I couldn't find anything up to date for schools, and Vector was a brilliant body for schools when that was, and it came out, and it was there around the time of smart boards being new technology and things like that. And every school got, you know, free A3 fold-out papers, and there's nothing now really, is there? There's optional things, token gestures here and there, but no, that the whole being anonymous online is the only safe way I can think that users, especially learners. Say again.
If you don't trust the tool, if you don't trust an environment, the natural persuasion is you revert back to more human, basic ways, which is I'll anonymize, I won't put my details here, there, and everywhere. And that's one solution, but it's not really a solution. The better solution is to understand how to use it safely and purposefully, and if it's the right tool. And I guess that's the bit that I was bouncing back to you, Clara and Darren, was that next bit, which is how do we look inside that black box, and what else are we looking for?
I mean,
so Darren, before you hop in, I just want to comment on the anonymization. Oh, now I can't speak of use, because I was thinking about something that Julian McGrant out of the Australian e-safety commissioner had mentioned in an interview. She had talked to a social media CEO who had told her that within just a few seconds of use in a social media account, even if there's a fake birthday, they are actually able to identify that it's a child using the social media account through their habits and their behavioral profile. So even if we anonymize, tech companies are able to identify quite a bit of information about the child that's using the data, even if they may not have the name of that child. They have the location, they have the age group, and they have other informational data around male, female, and so on and so forth. But it leads me, and I'm going to throw it back to you, Darren, because you and I have talked a lot about what can schools do. And we've talked about the future of sort of in-prem large language models, schools building their own solutions. And you and I are also building our own solutions so that we become independent in a way from these big tech organizations. And I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about what in-prem is and what we have discussed there, because I think that could be a future solution for a lot of schools.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, to date, education technology has been gate kept by developers, developing teams, whether it be Microsoft or Google or any of the others. But essentially, you've got a bunch of people who are working on building solutions. But what we're seeing now, with a combination, I think, of different factors at play, one of them is the fact we can start to build our own. Obviously, you know, we've been talking about it, and Matt and I have been talking about this as well. You know, can we actually build solutions using AI coding tools and amongst other sort of ways in to actually bring the expertise inside of schools? And also, can we start to host our own data and host our own models? As you say, you know, it won't be long before we will be able to self-host AI models, like quite large AI models, because the hardware is becoming increasingly fast and powerful and also affordable. So I think one of the challenges to the big companies that I think will happen in the next few years is that we will start to see more and more opportunities for schools to build their own. And they won't necessarily be these very, very large solutions, you know, these sort of very large enterprise level solutions. They'll be quite small solutions, which might fulfill one or two particular needs. And I think that will challenge the hegemony, if you like, of education technology suppliers. And I think that will be a good thing, because I think it will mean that schools will more likely take more risks, because they'll be able to work within their own sandbox, and they'll be able to kind of craft solutions that work for them, as opposed to sort of importing solutions which sort of kind of work, but don't really. But then that's the only choice they've got. So yeah, I see some big disruption coming down the track in the next year or two, definitely.
I think it's interesting now, Darren. I mean, where you are, Clara, doesn't areas of Catalonia have a digital democracy agreement of some sort, and they'll only use Web3 based software in some of the schools and things, which I think is already, we're already seeing a move to was what Darren's just referenced, and I'm all for that, because ultimately I think that we're getting to the stage where you can only fully trust what you know from the ground up. So the concept of digital democracy is one I'm trying to keep on top of, but I'm failing to keep on top of everything at the moment. But yeah, digital democracy, the future, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our school districts here in Catalonia, of course, it's still top-down decisions, but it is built around the concept of democratic use, and so there are some development there. And then, of course, we have one of EU's quantum computers being built right here in town as well, in our supercomputing center. And so where I live in Barcelona has become a bit of a new tech hub as well. And we're seeing a lot of movements towards really understanding how to build in-prem large language models into the ecosystem, so that organizations have their own large language models. You can download them as open source, so it's a question of having hardware that's powerful enough to run it based on your needs, but it gives them some autonomy in exactly building something that is perfectly suited to exactly what they need, rather than subscribing to a product that may have some functionalities that are useful, but sit in the background and collect data and with unexplainable information about how it's trained and where data is going. And I think we will see more and more organizations, especially very large organizations, wanting to establish that independence. But it's also a very promising solution for smaller schools that have limited resources, who have relied on free subscriptions that are offered by vendors. Schools will be able to build their own systems and therefore use their own servers and have better oversight over their data. It doesn't mean that it becomes incredibly easy. There's still things around tech governance and AI governance and cybersecurity that needs to be attended to, but it gives schools that independence also to align their technology with curriculum, with values, with missions, with their vision, and their cultural and ideological system that they're in. And I think we do see that more here, as well as some promising models that are developing among other places in France, in Sweden as well, where public AI has been developed for public organizations. So I think we are seeing some move in that direction. And I believe that breakdown in trust that we are seeing, where schools, educators are hesitant to use the technology, and students are hesitant to use it because they don't know if they're allowed to or how to do it right. They see people get in trouble. I think that helps drive that move towards wanting to be more independent in the different schools. So I think that will be definitely something to follow in the years to come.
Clara, one thing you touched on there, and I think it's a fear, because I support that when you lack trust, you want to try and regain control. Not an unusual path and journey. And there's a thing here about, we think the more we go from generic big systems to much more focused, localized educational resource systems, then we're going to get better at efficacy. But we're almost following this timeline loop here. If we were convinced by all big tech that we didn't want to store data on a server in our building. We didn't want to have all our individual ownership. The safest and best place was in the cloud. So we put all of our data up in the cloud over time, and we lost the individual skills in many of the smaller schools of having a dedicated technician, network expert, engineer, and so on. And suddenly, with the advent of AI, whilst there's all these huge potentials, we almost come full circle to this idea of the safest way is to use your own local system, and then you don't have to worry. Now, I think the nuance there is your own local system doesn't have to be in a cupboard in your school. That's the distinction, just for those listening, is it can be a closed cloud up for yourself, you know, and you can have your own cloud. I mean, let's be honest, where's the cloud? It's just somebody else's computer somewhere, isn't it? So, but you know, I think that was just a bit I wanted to make a distinction on there, because the idea of private cloud almost is where we could be talking, or education only cloud from a public sector perspective. That's my just point about making sure we bring everybody along for a ride. Can I just ask one other question as a bit of a challenge, because we've talked a bit about this, and hopefully it will trigger Matt as well. I'm aware of the time. When we talk about AI and commercialization, all these bits and pieces, the natural pushback consistently in all of our arguments, somewhere along the line, feeds into pedagogy. It's got to be pedagogy led. It's got to be about what's right for teaching in the classroom. Do you think there is a bit at the moment of a culture of redefining the term pedagogy to suit? At its simplest level, pedagogy, you know, the method and practice of teaching. Why shouldn't the method and practice of teaching be a robot at the front of the room named Steve that just points at children and sends the information direct into their eyeball? That's still a method and practice of teaching. I mean, clearly highly inefficient, and who would want it? I've exaggerated hugely for effect. But is there maybe a pushback that we're saying, no, pedagogy can't change? Or are we saying, hang on, this isn't about changing the way we teach, this is about how we filter the right tools?
Me? Oh, blimey, I'm definitely not clever enough to answer that question properly, Al, but I mean, I'll make a confession straight away. I've never read a book on pedagogy, and our school does quite well. I know we have a pedagogy. I could probably articulate it, and the staff are all the same because we've discussed this. I don't know is the answer to that, and I think it links to this whole approach in education. It's one size fits all. Our school is unique. Every school is unique. So the pedagogy isn't book driven. It's what you do. So yeah, I don't know is my answer to that question.
I suspect we might all define it differently. Clara, Darren, you have a view?
I mean, I guess mine is I'm very simplistic in and I'm with Matt. I'm not a big reader of books on pedagogy. My view, I think, is fairly simplistic in that we're now in a situation where we have, or students have tools available to help unblock them, and ultimately the learning process is we have something to do, we have to learn it, and we're blocked, and so things have to unblock us. And that thing could be a teacher at the front of the classroom, it could be a textbook, it could be Google, or it now could be AI. But ultimately, what we need to move towards is a system whereby students care about what they do, and that they care about the process, and they care about the outcome, and it's meaningful to them. And it really doesn't matter whether it's a teacher at the front of the classroom or whether it's an online learning platform. If the students are being given work that has no inherent meaning for them and is just not of no real interest to them in their lives and the world that they live in, there are quite frankly too many alternatives for them now. Both alternatives to help them learn, but also alternatives to keep them occupied and keep them out of trouble. And I think that's where we have the biggest challenge in education at the moment, is that it really doesn't have much to do with the technology. It has everything to do with moving the education system, like Matt's been doing, obviously, with his school, towards kids doing the stuff that means things, getting them outside, getting them working on meaningful real world projects, because actually you can learn the stuff that you need to learn through other mechanisms than just sitting and passively absorbing, whether it be a teacher, whether it be Steve the robot. It's much more about the meaning that sits behind what we do. And I think that's the big challenge that we have. And that's basically what we've had kind of beaten into us over the last however many hundreds of years, that education is the passive absorption of knowledge, which I think that has to change.
Within that, Darren, I think the bigger challenge within that is that the learners from a very young age are now aware of this as well.
Of course they are. Of course they are. They get it. They understand.
We're in an education system that they recognise is really not providing them with the skills and knowledge, and I think especially the skills more than the knowledge nowadays, that they need for future jobs of the future.
So if we recognise that, and we recognise it's all about agency and engagement and all the rest of it, there is some good that comes from that direction of travel. So I guess it comes full circle in our journey to you, Clara, which is there are times when it's good to engage with commercial partners, to engage with commercial vendors. How do we do that whilst at the same time providing that governance, oversight and protection when it comes to engaging in technology where we can't see under the hood?
Well, so that's a big question to finish. We could spend another hour or
I figured it's your area that you might want to share.
Yeah, but you know, a little bit bouncing off of what Matthew and Darren are noticing as well, this lack of engagement, I think, is that a lot of the ed tech are designed at minimum around these assumptions we've had around what is good pedagogy and what is good curriculum. But the truth is that the little nuggets we have in school today are Generation Alpha children, and they are not wired the same way, even as Gen Z children that are now have graduated out of secondary school and have headed off to university. They're a whole different breed. They are deeply digital native children, and they are experimenters, and they're used to figuring stuff out on their own. If they have a question, they're not going to sit and wait for an adult to teach them that in the classroom. They'll just hop online and figure it out. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but they figure things out. And I think in order for us to move meaningfully forward to bridge that divide is to get those kids involved in the design process. You know, we need to hear how they're thinking. We need to get to know them. We have assumptions about them, but their brains are different. Their cognition is different. Their wants and desires are incredibly different. And the world that they are growing into is different, and they know it. When they head out of secondary school, they won't be able to find a summer job where they can get an entry-level position for a gap year or even for the summer, because many of those types of jobs are going to be replaced with AI-driven technology. And those kids, they know it already. So we need to get in conversation with them and then realign our ideas of what good pedagogy is and what good teaching methodology is in relationship with them as a collaborative effort. And I think that also teaches them some of those unbelievably important skills of the future. Good collaboration, communication across many different types of departments and age groups. It teaches them technical skills. It teaches them design and systems thinking. And I think that we're missing a phenomenal opportunity to really work with our children.
Yeah, I just echo that. They're so savvy now. They learn so much stuff on TikTok. They're so ahead of the game. We have to kind of ultimately come to the realization that we're not actually in control of this narrative fully, and so therefore we need to invite them into the tent, and we need to be working with students definitely, because they can give us an awful lot. So no, I fully agree with that.
It's a nice way to bring it together, because this conversation started about the commercialization with AI into education, and there's kind of a recognition that whilst we're looking in education about how do we do things safely and governance it and make sure that we have those controls, in parallel the world is changing. AI is infusing the workplace, so we don't get a choice to wait. We have to look and say, how do we do it with guardrails? How do we do it safely? What I will say is some of the best lessons I continue to see have no technology in the room ever. So with our appetite and enthusiasm for AI, we need to remember that actually we also want kids to grow up in a climb up a tree, do the cool stuff kind of way as well. But the thing that I always try and share at the end of these kind of conversations with all of us is just follow the evidence-informed edtech, evidence-informed AI. Look for the evidence of the solutions you're looking at, where they're, in some cases, where their pedagogy is. Sometimes it's not just about pedagogy, it's about actually looking at new ways that we can measure impact and where that's relevant within the education space as well. I think on that happy note, we've run out of the virtual tape in the recorder that we're doing for this very high-tech conversation. Not quite that I've suddenly assumed the goodbye bit, but I just want to share a thank you, and I really appreciate a chance to chew the fat with you good folks as well.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, everyone.
Listen to it all. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
The future is here now, it's no AI.